My name is Keisha, and I am 32 years old. My mother looked me dead in the eye with tears streaming down her face and told me we were absolutely destitute. She said the medical bills were drowning her and that we could not even afford a weekend trip to see our sick aunt in Detroit. I believed her. I drained my savings account that very night to help her. But 24 hours later, I was standing in the middle of Hartsfield Jackson International Airport, watching my mother, my brother, and his wife board a flight. They were not going to Detroit, and they were certainly not broke. As I held the boarding pass, my mother had accidentally dropped my hand started to shake. It did not say economy. It said Delta One. And the destination was not Michigan. It was the Maldives. My brother Jamal laughed in my face and said, "Stay home and watch the house, Keisha. You are too expensive to bring along." I stood there alone, realizing my $5,000 emergency transfer had not paid for medicine. It had paid for their champagne. Before I tell you how I turned their dream vacation into a financial nightmare, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button if you have ever been the one paying the bills while everyone else takes the credit. The humidity in Atlanta was already suffocating that morning, but the air inside my 2012 Honda Accord felt even heavier. The air conditioning had broken 3 months ago, and I had not fixed it because every spare dime I made went into the family pot. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, as I navigated the chaotic traffic on I-85 heading south toward the airport. In the rearview mirror, I could see them. My mother Bernice was fanning herself with a magazine, complaining about the heat in my car. My brother Jamal was tapping furiously on his newest iPhone, the one that cost more than my mortgage payment. Next to him sat his wife Emily, looking out the window with that permanent expression of mild disgust she reserved specifically for me. They were dressed for a funeral, or at least that is the vibe they were trying to project. Somber colors, serious faces. "We are just going to Detroit to see Auntie Rose." My mother had said, her voice trembling just enough to be convincing. "She is not doing well, Keisha. We need to go pay our respects before it is too late." I felt a pang of guilt that I could not go with them. I had offered, but Jamal had shut me down immediately, saying the tickets were too expensive and they could barely afford the three they had scraped together. He told me I needed to stay behind to watch the house and manage the mail. He made it sound like a critical mission, but I knew the truth. I was the wallet, not the guest. The trunk of my car was weighed down with 4 massive suitcases. For a weekend trip to Detroit, it seemed excessive, but Emily had insisted she needed options in case they had to stay for a funeral. I did not question it. I never questioned them. I was the good daughter, the responsible one, the one who worked 60 hours a week as a forensic accountant, chasing down hidden assets for corporations while living like a pauper to support my family. We pulled up to the Delta terminal, and the chaos of the airport hit us. Horns honking, police whistles blowing, the sheer mass of humanity trying to get somewhere. I put the car in park and popped the trunk. Jamal did not move. He sat there finishing his text message while I got out into the sweltering heat to unload their bags. I dragged the heavy Louis Vuitton suitcases onto the curb. I paused for a second, looking at the luggage. These were brand new. Hard-shell designer bags that cost at least $2,000 apiece. I felt a flicker of confusion. If we were so broke that I had to transfer $5,000 yesterday for urgent medical bills, how could they afford $8,000 in luggage? Maybe they borrowed them, I told myself, pushing the suspicion down. I was a forensic accountant. It was my job to be suspicious, but not of my own blood, not of the mother who raised me. Jamal finally stepped out of the car, stretching his legs and adjusting his designer sunglasses. He did not say thank you. He just motioned for a sky cap. Emily followed, checking her reflection in the car window, making sure her hair was perfect. We walked into the terminal, and the cool air conditioning was a relief. My mother was walking ahead, clutching her purse tight. She looked nervous, which I assumed was worry about Auntie Rose. We approached the check-in kiosks. "I will handle the tags," my mother said quickly, trying to block my view of the screen. You just wait here, Keisha. You do not need to pay for parking. Go on home. I am not leaving until you are checked in. Mom, I said, stepping forward. It is the least I can do. She fumbled with her purse, her hands shaking slightly. As she pulled out her ID, a piece of paper fluttered to the floor. It must have been printed at home, a backup boarding pass. It landed face up on the polished terrazzo floor, right between my worn-out sneakers and Emily's Gucci sandals. I bent down to pick it up. My mother lunged for it, but I was faster. I stood up holding the paper. I expected to see a coach seat to Detroit Metro Airport. I expected to see a boarding time for a budget connection. Instead, the bold letters stared back at me, mocking my entire existence. Passenger Bernice Williams, Class Delta 1, Destination Male Maldives via Dubai. The world seemed to stop spinning. The noise of the airport faded into a dull roar. I looked at the price printed in the corner on the receipt portion. $12,400 for one ticket. I looked up. My mother was pale, her hand covering her mouth. But it was Jamal who reacted first. He stepped forward and snatched the paper from my hand, his face twisting into a sneer. "Give me that," he snapped. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You said you were going to Detroit. You said Auntie Rose was dying. You said we were broke." Jamal laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that cut deeper than any knife. He smoothed out the boarding pass and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "Look at your face, Keisha," he said, shaking his head. "You always have to be so dramatic. Mom has worked hard her whole life. She raised us. She sacrificed for us. She deserves a break. She needs this rest." "A break," I repeated. "A break costs $36,000 for flights alone. I transferred $5,000 to Mom yesterday because she was crying about not being able to afford her blood pressure medication." "And that helped," Jamal said, shrugging. "It covered the upgrade fees and the taxes, so thanks for that, sis." I looked at my mother, expecting her to be ashamed, expecting her to apologize. But as she saw Jamal taking the lead, her posture changed. She stopped looking nervous and started looking annoyed. "You do not understand, Keisha," my mother said, her voice taking on that manipulative whine I knew so well. "My health is failing. The doctor said I need a warm climate. I need relaxation. The stress of being poor is killing me. This trip is medicinal." "Medicinal?" I asked incredulously. "You are going to the Maldives in first class while I am driving a car with no air conditioning and eating instant noodles to pay your bills." Emily chimed in, then stepping up beside Jamal and linking her arm through his. Her voice was syrupy sweet, the kind of tone you use with a slow child. "Oh, Keisha, stop making this about you. We did not invite you, because frankly you would just bring down the vibe. You are always so serious, always counting pennies. We want to have fun. Besides, look at you." She gestured vaguely at my outfit, my plain black slacks and button-down shirt, the uniform of a woman who worked too hard and had no one to impress. "You do not exactly fit the aesthetic we are going for," she continued. "You are the house sitter, Keisha. That is your role. You are good at it. You stay home, you keep things running, and we go out and live. That is how this family works." My brother nodded, agreeing with his wife. "Exactly," he said. "You would just be a burden. Think about it, Keisha. Who would pay for your ticket? Us. We do not have money to waste on charity cases. You are better off at home. You save us money by staying behind." The words hung in the air between us. Charity case. Burden. House sitter. I looked at these three people. My flesh and blood. I saw the diamond tennis bracelet on my mother's wrist that I had not noticed before. I saw the new Rolex on Jamal's arm. I saw the designer luggage. They were not broke. They had never been broke. I was the bank and they were bleeding me dry. I took a step back. I felt a strange sensation spreading through my chest. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was clarity. Cold, absolute clarity. "So the $5,000, I said, my voice steady now. "That was a lie. It was a contribution," Jamal corrected. "To the Family Happiness Fund." Now, if you are done interrogating us, we have a flight to catch. The lounge is waiting and I want a pre-flight drink." He turned his back on me, dismissing me as if I were a servant. Emily followed him, but she paused for just a second. She looked over her shoulder, a smirk playing on her lips. "Do not worry, Keisha," she said. "I will send you plenty of pictures so you can see what you are missing. Oh, and please remember to water my orchids. The humidity in the house needs to be just right or they will die. Do not let them die, okay?" She turned and walked away, her heels clicking rhythmically on the floor. My mother lingered for a split second. She looked at me, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of guilt. But then she sighed, shaking her head as if I were the one disappointing her. "Go home, Keisha," she said. "Fix the air conditioning in your car. Stop looking so miserable. It is unattractive. We will be back in 2 weeks. Have dinner ready when we get home." She turned and followed her golden son and his wife toward the priority security lane. I watched them go. I watched them hand their passports to the agent. I watched them laugh as they walked through the metal detectors without a backward glance. I stood there in the middle of the busy terminal alone. People rushed past me, dragging their bags, running to their gates, going places. I was going nowhere. I walked back out into the heat. The sun was beating down on the asphalt, baking the air. I got into my car, and the heat inside was suffocating. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel until my hands hurt. My phone dinged. It was a notification from my bank. My balance was dangerously low. That $5,000 transfer had wiped out my emergency fund. I had $300 left to last me 2 weeks. I looked at the dashboard of my car. The check engine light was flickering. They were drinking champagne in Delta One, heading to a tropical paradise on my dime. And I was about to drive home to a house that they treated as a hotel where I was the unpaid maid. I started the engine. The car sputtered and wheezed before roaring to life. I did not cry. I had cried enough over this family. I had cried when they forgot my college graduation because Jamal had a basketball game. I had cried when they borrowed my credit card and ruined my credit score 3 years ago. I had cried yesterday when my mother told me she might die without that money. No more tears. I was a forensic accountant. I found hidden things for a living. I traced money trails that people tried very hard to bury. I exposed fraud. I took down executives who thought they were untouchable. I had never turned that lens on my own family. I had always respected their privacy, believed their stories about bad luck and hard times. But as I pulled out of the airport parking lot, a new thought took root in my mind. They thought I was just the house sitter. They thought I was the wallet. They thought I was stupid. They were about to find out that you never ever steal from the accountant. I drove home not to water the orchids but to tear the house apart. If they could lie about a $12,000 plane ticket, what else were they lying about? The game had changed. They were in the air, but I was on the ground. And by the time they landed, I intended to know every single secret they had buried. I merged onto the highway, and for the first time that day, I smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who just realized they held the keys to the kingdom and the match to burn it down. The sky over Atlanta opened up just as I merged onto the interstate, and what had been oppressive heat instantly turned into a torrential downpour. My windshield wipers were streaking badly, dragging water across the glass rather than clearing it, and I had to lean forward, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white just to see the taillights ahead of me. It felt fitting. The universe was crying because I had run out of tears. My phone sat in the cup holder, buzzing every few minutes with notifications I was afraid to look at. When I hit a red light near the exit for our neighborhood, I finally glanced down. It was a text message from my bank. A low balance alert. Your available balance is $312.42. I stared at the number as the rain hammered against the roof of my car. Yesterday, that balance had been over $5,000. It had been my safety net, my car repair fund, my future escape plan. Now it was gone, transferred into my mother's account, because she had sworn on her life that the pharmacy wouldn't release her heart medication without payment. She had cried on the phone, gasping for breath, telling me her chest hurt. I had panicked. I had sent the money within 30 seconds. And now I knew that money wasn't coursing through her veins, saving her life. It was probably sitting in a crystal flute in the form of vintage Dom Perignon, somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. The light turned green, and I drove mechanically, the numbness spreading from my chest to my limbs. I turned onto our street. It was a nice street lined with large oak trees and respectable brick houses. We lived in one of the larger ones, a 2-story colonial that my mother was endlessly proud of. She told everyone she bought it with the insurance money from my father's accident 5 years ago. That was another lie I had swallowed to keep the peace. The truth was, the down payment had come from my first big bonus at the firm, and I had been paying the mortgage every month since under the guise of rent. I pulled into the driveway expecting the familiar comfort of home, but even through the curtain of rain, something looked wrong. The house looked dark, not just empty, but abandoned. The porch light, which I kept on a timer, was not lit despite the storm darkening the sky. I grabbed my bag and made a run for the front porch, splashing through puddles that were forming on the uneven walkway Jamal had promised to fix 6 months ago. I fumbled for my keys, my hair already plastered to my face, but before I could slide the key into the lock, my eyes caught a flash of bright color against the dark wood of the door. I stopped. My heart hammered against my ribs loud enough to drown out the thunder. Stuck to the front door right at eye level were 3 brightly colored notices. They were taped aggressively, the adhesive leaving marks on the finish. The first one was pink. Fulton County Water Services. Service disconnected. Non-payment. The second one was neon orange. Georgia Power. Final notice. Service suspended. The third was a white envelope taped securely with the word Sheriff stamped in red ink on the outside. I stood there on the porch, water dripping from the hem of my slacks onto the welcome mat that said, "Bless this home." I reached out and ripped the orange notice off the door. My eyes scanned the numbers. Past due amount, $1,482. I ripped the pink one down next. Water bill, $890. I did not open the white envelope. I knew what it was. You do not work in forensic accounting without recognizing a pre-foreclosure notice or a lien warning when you see one. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air in the house was stagnant and hot. Without the air conditioning running, the humidity had seeped into the walls, making the whole place smell musty and old. I flipped the light switch by the door out of habit. Nothing happened. The house remained swallowed in shadows. I walked into the kitchen, my footsteps echoing on the hard wood. I went to the sink and lifted the handle. A hollow gurgle, a spit of air, and then nothing. No water. I dropped my bag on the kitchen island and just stood there in the dark. Every month on the first, like clockwork, I transferred $3,000 to my mother's account. We had an agreement. I paid rent, which she said covered the utilities, the taxes, and the groceries. I paid for the internet because I needed it for work. I bought my own food because Emily complained that my healthy groceries took up too much space in the pantry. $3,000 a month, $36,000 a year. And yet I was standing in a house with no lights, no water, and a foreclosure warning on the door. I sank onto one of the bar stools. The silence of the house was heavy, pressing in on my ears. Usually this kitchen was loud. The TV in the living room would be blaring reality shows. Emily would be on speakerphone gossiping with her friends. Jamal would be clattering around, making a mess while looking for snacks. Now there was just the sound of the rain and the steady rhythm of my own breathing, which was starting to come faster and faster. They left me here. The realization hit me harder than the airport betrayal. They did not just leave me behind to save money on a ticket. They left me in a house that was uninhabitable. They knew. They had to know. You do not get your power cut off without months of warnings. You do not get your water shut off overnight. They knew the lights would go out. They knew the taps would run dry. And they got on a plane to the Maldives anyway, leaving me to come home to this. I felt a wave of nausea. I hadn't eaten since a granola bar at 6 this morning. My stomach was cramping, but the thought of food made me gag. I needed water. I reached for a glass and then remembered. No water. I opened the refrigerator. The light did not come on. The air inside was cool but fading fast. I grabbed a bottle of water from the back, trying not to look at the shelves stocked with expensive organic produce and premium cheeses that Emily insisted on. Food that would all be rotten in 2 days. I drank the water in long gulps, trying to wash down the bile rising in my throat. Then I opened the pantry. I needed something to settle my stomach. I pushed past the boxes of gourmet crackers and imported pasta that I wasn't allowed to touch. In the back corner on the bottom shelf was my stash. A 6-pack of instant ramen noodles, chicken flavor, 50 cents a pack. I grabbed one. I couldn't boil water. I couldn't microwave it. I sat there in the dim light of the kitchen peeling the foil lid off the cup. I poured a little of my bottled water over the dry block of noodles. It wouldn't be hot. It wouldn't be good. But it was food. I waited for the noodles to soften slightly, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor as the sun began to set behind the storm clouds. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I had 5% battery left and no way to charge it until I went out to my car. I should save the battery. I should turn it off. But my thumb moved of its own accord, opening Instagram. There it was, the first post on my feed. Emily. The photo was high definition, filtered to perfection. It showed 2 hands clinking crystal flutes of champagne against the backdrop of an airplane window. Outside, the sky was a brilliant, unnatural blue above a sea of fluffy clouds. You could see the edge of the lie-flat seat and the personal entertainment screen showing a map of the flight path over the Atlantic. The caption read, "Finally escaping the toxicity. Champagne in the clouds. Blessed. Self-made. Toxicity." I stared at the word until it blurred. I was the toxicity. Me. The woman sitting in the dark, eating cold raw noodles in a house they had run into the ground. I was the toxicity because I asked them to turn off lights when they left a room. I was the toxicity because I asked Jamal to maybe look for a job instead of playing video games all day. I was the toxicity because I existed as a constant reminder that their lifestyle was funded by my labor. I put the phone down on the counter face down. I took a bite of the crunchy, lukewarm noodles. They tasted like salt and cardboard. I chewed slowly, forcing myself to swallow. $3,000 a month, plus the random 50s and hundreds Mom needed for groceries, plus the credit card bill I paid off last Christmas because they wanted to have a good holiday, plus the $5,000 yesterday. Where did it go? My accountant brain finally woke up, pushing past the grief and the shock. It was a familiar sensation, a cold sharpening of my focus. The emotional noise faded into the background, replaced by a grid of numbers and questions. The mortgage was $2,000 a month. Utilities should be maybe $400. Taxes and insurance were escrowed. If I was giving them $3,000 just for household expenses, and they were not paying the electric bill, and they were not paying the water bill, and judging by the sheriff's notice, they were not paying the property taxes either, then where was the money going? It wasn't just mismanagement. You can mismanage a few $100s. You can forget a bill once or twice. This was thousands of dollars a month, disappearing for years. I looked around the shadowed kitchen. I looked at the high-end blender on the counter, the espresso machine that cost more than my first car, the designer throw blankets draped over the chairs in the living room. I stood up. The noodles were forgotten. I walked out of the kitchen and down the hallway to the home office. This was my mother's domain. She kept the door locked, always saying she had important church documents and neighborhood association files in there that couldn't be disturbed. She told me she handled all the household administration, so I wouldn't have to worry my pretty little head about it. I had believed her. I had been so grateful to have one less thing to manage that I never asked to see a receipt. I never asked for a login. I stood in front of the locked door. In my car, I had a toolkit. I kept it there for emergencies because my car was unreliable and I often had to fix minor things on the side of the road. I didn't need a key. I wasn't a guest anymore. I wasn't the house sitter, I was the bank. And the bank was coming for an audit. I walked back through the dark house out the front door and into the rain. I opened my trunk and grabbed the toolkit. The metal was cold and heavy in my hand. When I walked back inside, I didn't wipe my feet. I tracked mud and water across the pristine white rug in the foyer. I marched to the office door. I jammed a flathead screwdriver into the lock mechanism. I didn't finesse it. I didn't try to pick it gently. I drove it in with the heel of my hand and twisted hard. Wood splintered, metal crunched. The lock gave way with a loud snap. I kicked the door open. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke, which surprised me because my mother swore she had quit 10 years ago. But that wasn't what stopped me. It was the stacks of paper. The desk was buried. The floor was covered. Boxes were overflowing. Unopened envelopes. Late notices. Collection warnings. But in the corner sat a filing cabinet. A beige metal two-drawer cabinet that looked orderly compared to the chaos of the room. I walked over to it. Locked, of course. I used the screwdriver again, popping the lock in seconds. I pulled the top drawer open. It wasn't church documents. It wasn't neighborhood association flyers. It was a meticulous archive of spending. My mother might have been terrible at paying bills, but she was excellent at hoarding receipts. I pulled out a file labeled Current Year. I started flipping through it by the light of my phone flashlight. Receipts for Saks Fifth Avenue, Nordstrom, Sephora. A receipt for a Louis Vuitton Speedy bag purchased 3 months ago, $3,200. A receipt for a set of veneers from a cosmetic dentist, $6,000. A receipt for a rental car, a luxury SUV rented for a weekend trip Jamal took with his boys, $800. I flipped faster. My heart was pounding not with fear, but with a rising cold fury. There were no utility bill receipts, no mortgage payment confirmations. I pulled out a bank statement from the back of the file. It was for an account I didn't recognize. An account in my mother's name at a bank across town. I scanned the deposits. First of the month, $3,000. Transfer from Keisha. 15th of the month, $500. Transfer from Keisha. 22nd of the month, $200. Transfer from Keisha. And then the withdrawals. Withdrawal ATM Casino, $500. Withdrawal POS Gucci, $1,200. Withdrawal POS Delta Airlines, $400. She wasn't just skimming off the top. She was taking everything I gave her and blowing it on luxury goods and gambling while the roof over our heads was being foreclosed on. I dropped the file on the floor. I felt dizzy. The $5,000 for medicine. I frantically looked for the most recent statement or a transaction receipt. I found it on top of a pile on the desk. A printed confirmation from a travel agent. Upgrade fees, 4 passengers. Economy to Delta One. Total cost $4,800. Paid via transfer. I closed my eyes. The darkness of the room swirled around me. They didn't just steal my money. They stole my safety. They stole my stability. They stole my trust. I thought we were a team. I thought we were struggling together, surviving together. But I was the only one struggling. They were feasting on my carcass. I looked at the file cabinet again. There was a bottom drawer. I crouched down and pulled it open. This drawer was different. It didn't have receipts. It had legal documents, manila envelopes stuffed thick. I pulled one out. It had my name on it, Keisha Williams. I opened it. Inside was a credit card statement, a Platinum American Express card. I didn't have an American Express card. I looked at the name on the account, Keisha Williams. I looked at the balance, $22,400. I dropped the paper as if it were burning. I pulled out another envelope. A personal loan agreement from a predatory lender. $10,000. High interest. In my name. Signed with a signature that looked a lot like mine, but had a loop on the K that I never made. Jamal. I recognized his handwriting. He tried to copy my signature, but he always flourished the capitals. I sat back on my heels on the floor of the dark office, surrounded by the evidence of my financial ruin. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. The low battery warning flashed. I stood up slowly. I gathered the files, the bank statements, the credit card bills, the loan documents. I piled them into my arms. I walked out of the office, leaving the broken door swinging on its hinges. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a box of heavy-duty trash bags from under the sink. I put the documents inside. I sealed it tight. Then I walked out to my car. I put the bag in the trunk next to my toolkit. I got into the driver's seat and plugged my phone into the car charger. I didn't turn on the engine yet. I just sat there listening to the rain. I wasn't going to stay in this house. I couldn't. It wasn't a home. It was a crime scene. I picked up my phone. It had charged to 7%. I opened my contacts and scrolled past my mother, past Jamal, past Emily. I found the number for Marcus. Marcus was my best friend from college. He was also the most ruthless shark of a lawyer in Atlanta. He dealt with high net worth divorces and corporate fraud. He charged $800 an hour, and he was worth every penny. He knew I made good money. He knew I was a forensic accountant, but he was the only person on earth who knew about the crypto investment I had made 7 years ago, the one I had never touched, the one that was my real secret, my real safety net, the one even my mother couldn't find because it wasn't in a bank she knew about. He knew I wasn't actually broke. He knew I lived like this because I was trying to save my family. I pressed call. It rang twice. Keisha Marcus's voice was warm but alert. "It is 10 p.m. on a Tuesday. You never call this late. Is everything okay?" "Marcus," I said. My voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. "I need you to clear your schedule for tomorrow morning." "What happened?" he asked, his tone shifting instantly to professional mode. "I am going to send you some photos," I said. "My mother and brother have committed identity theft, credit card fraud, and elder abuse, if you count the fact that I feel about 80 years old right now." I paused, looking at the dark house one last time. "And Marcus? I need to file for an eviction." "Eviction?" Marcus asked, confused. "For who?" "For everyone," I said. "I am taking back my life. And I am going to need a really good lawyer to help me put my family in prison." I started the car. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the foreclosure notice on the door one last time. I backed out of the driveway. I wasn't going to Detroit. I wasn't going to the Maldives. I was going to war. The silence in the house was heavy and absolute, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the kitchen windows. I sat on the cold tile floor with my back pressed against the dishwasher that I now knew would not run. The darkness was not just an absence of light. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders, a suffocating blanket woven from betrayal and neglect. In my hand, I held the block of instant ramen. I had not bothered to find a bowl. There was no point without water to soften it or heat to cook it. I brought the dry square of noodles to my lips and took a bite. It crunched loudly in the empty room, a harsh sound that seemed to mock the luxury my family was currently experiencing. The taste was like dust and sodium dry, and unyielding against my tongue. I chewed mechanically, forcing my jaw to work, forcing my throat to swallow, because my body was trembling from low blood sugar and shock. I reached for the bottle of water I had salvaged from the back of the fridge. It was lukewarm now. I took a small sip, rationing it. I did not know when the water company would come to turn the service back on, even if I paid the bill immediately. It could be days. I sat there chewing the raw noodles, and I looked around the shadows of the kitchen. This was the kitchen where I had cooked Thanksgiving dinner last year because my mother claimed her arthritis was acting up. This was the kitchen where I had helped Jamal write his business plan for a sneaker cleaning service that never launched. This was the kitchen where I had listened to Emily complain about how hard it was to find good help while I did her dishes. I had paid for this granite countertop. I had paid for the stainless steel refrigerator that was now dark. I had paid for the tiles freezing my legs. My phone screen lit up in the darkness, a beacon of artificial light. I had been trying to conserve the battery, but a notification pushed through. It was Instagram. Against my better judgment, against the screaming instinct in my gut that told me to just put the phone down and close my eyes, I picked it up. My thumb hovered over the screen. I saw Emily's handle. She had posted a story 5 minutes ago. I tapped the circle. The image filled my screen, bright and high definition, a stark contrast to my gloomy reality. It was a photo taken from inside the plane. The lighting was warm and golden. In the foreground, 2 crystal flutes of champagne touched in a toast. The liquid inside bubbled pale gold, catching the light. Through the window behind the glasses, you could see the wing of the plane and a bed of fluffy white clouds illuminated by the sun. They were chasing the sunset while I was sitting in the dark. But it was the caption that made the air leave my lungs. It was written in a swirly, elegant font overlaying the clouds. Champagne on the plane, finally escaping the toxicity. Blessed. I read it once, then I read it again. Toxicity. The word echoed in my mind, bouncing off the walls of the silent house. I was the toxicity. Me. The woman sitting on the floor eating raw noodles because she had given them her last dime. I was the toxic one. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, but it came out as a dry heave. The audacity was breathtaking. It was almost impressive in its complete detachment from reality. To them, I was toxic because I was the reality check. I was toxic because I was the one who asked questions. I was the barrier between them and their delusions of grandeur. Every time I asked my mother if she had paid the light bill, I was being negative. Every time I asked Jamal when he was going to contribute to the household, I was being unsupportive. Every time I existed in their space, without giving them exactly what they wanted, I was a pollutant in their atmosphere. They did not hate me because I was cruel. They hated me because I was the mirror. When they looked at me, they saw their own failures reflecting back. They saw the bills they could not pay, the responsibilities they could not meet, and the lies they told themselves to sleep at night. And so they had to cut me out. They had to leave me behind, not just to save money on a plane ticket, but to cleanse their palate. They needed to go to the Maldives and pretend they were rich. They needed to pretend they were successful. They needed to pretend they earned that champagne. And they could not do that with me sitting next to them in economy, reminding them that the credit card was in my name. I stared at the photo of the champagne. I looked at the condensation on the glass. I imagined the cool, crisp taste of it. The hurt that had been crippling me since the airport began to recede. The sadness that had made me weep in the terminal evaporated like mist in the morning sun. In its place, something else began to form. It was cold. It was hard. It was sharp. It was the professional detachment I used when I audited a company that was embezzling millions. It was the clinical focus I applied when I traced hidden assets through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. I was no longer Keisha the daughter. I was no longer Keisha the sister. I was no longer the doormat or the ATM or the backup plan. I was the auditor, and they were the liability. I looked at the hashtag again. Blessed. They thought they were blessed because they had scammed their way into first class. They thought they had won because they had escaped the toxicity. They had no idea. They had not escaped the toxicity. They had just left the only person who was filtering it out for them. They had removed the only thing standing between them and the consequences of their own actions. I took another bite of the dry ramen. It didn't taste like despair anymore. It tasted like fuel. I finished the block of noodles. I drank the rest of the warm water. I wiped the crumbs from my lap. I looked at my phone one last time. I took a screenshot of Emily's story. Evidence. Then I stood up. My legs were stiff but steady. I walked through the dark house. I did not turn on my flashlight. I knew the layout of this house better than anyone. I knew where the floorboards creaked. I knew where the rug edges curled. I walked to the living room window and looked out at the rain. The streetlights reflected on the wet pavement. They wanted a life without me. They wanted to be free of my influence, my questions, my presence. I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would remove myself completely from the equation. I would take my name off the bills. I would take my money out of the accounts. I would take my credit score back. I would let them have their toxicity-free existence. And when the bills came due, when the lights went out for them, when the sheriff came back with an eviction notice that wasn't addressed to me, I would be watching. I turned away from the window. The darkness of the house didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt like a blank slate. It felt like cover. I had work to do. I went back to the kitchen and grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from the emergency drawer. I tested the beam. It cut through the gloom strong and bright. I was going to find everything. I was going to turn over every stone in this house. I was going to find every secret they had hidden, every lie they had told, every dime they had stolen. They were in the air sipping champagne thinking they were untouchable. But I was on the ground. And I was just getting started. The morning sun did not bring warmth, it only brought a harsh gray light that exposed the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air of the silent house. I had not slept. I had spent the remaining hours of the night sitting in the living room watching the shadows retreat and making a mental inventory of the betrayal. My eyes felt gritty and dry, but my mind was operating with a cold, terrifying precision. I stood up and stretched my stiff limbs. I was done crying, and I was done feeling sorry for myself. It was time to finish what I had started. Last night I had breached the perimeter of the home office, but I knew there was more. My mother was a woman of secrets, and she never kept all her eggs in one basket. I walked down the hallway to the master bedroom. This room had always been the forbidden city, the sanctuary, where no one was allowed to enter without express permission. Even when I paid the mortgage, I knocked before entering. Not today. The door was locked, of course. My mother locked everything. She treated information and access like currency, hoarding it to keep her value high. I reached up and pulled a bobby pin from my messy bun. It was a trick I had learned from a private investigator I worked with on a fraud case 2 years ago. Most interior door locks in these suburban houses were simple privacy locks, not security devices. They were designed to keep toddlers out, not a forensic accountant with a vendetta. I straightened the pin, inserted it into the small hole in the knob, and felt for the catch. It took 3 seconds. A soft click echoed in the hallway, and the knob turned. The room smelled like her, like expensive lavender perfume and secrets. I walked straight to the walk-in closet. It was lined with shelves of shoes and handbags that I had paid for. But I wasn't looking for fashion. I was looking for the shoebox. My mother had a habit she thought was discreet. Whenever she bought something she knew she shouldn't have, she hid the evidence in plain sight. She kept shoeboxes stacked high on the top shelf, claiming they were empty boxes she was saving for storage. I dragged the step stool over and climbed up. I began pulling down boxes. Empty. Empty. Winter scarves. Then I found it. A Nike shoebox that felt heavy. Too heavy to be empty, but not heavy enough to hold shoes. I climbed down and sat on the plush carpet. I lifted the lid. It was not shoes. It was a paper trail of narcissism. The box was stuffed to the brim with receipts. I dumped them out onto the carpet. They fluttered down like confetti at a parade for the world's most selfish woman. I picked up a receipt from 3 months ago. A Gucci Marmont shoulder bag, $2,400. The date was January 15th. I pulled up my banking app on my phone, which was currently charging on the nightstand. I scrolled back to January. On January 14th, I had transferred $2,500 to my mother. The memo line on the transfer read emergency dental surgery. I felt a cold laugh bubble up in my chest. Her teeth were fine. She just wanted a purse. I picked up another receipt. A pair of limited edition Air Jordan sneakers size 11. Jamal's size. Price tag $800. Date March 3rd. On March 2nd, I had sent $1,000 for property tax installment. I sorted through them faster now, my hands moving with professional speed. A day at the Four Seasons Spa. A diamond pendant. A set of high-end luggage, the very luggage I had loaded into the car yesterday. Every single time she had called me crying about a bill, about a medical emergency, about the house falling apart, she had been shopping. She had been funding a lifestyle she could not afford by exploiting a daughter she did not love. But the receipts were just the appetizer. At the bottom of the box, underneath the evidence of her spending, sat 3 thin booklets, bank passbooks. I opened the first one. It was an account with a credit union I didn't know she used. The balance history was staggering. $20,000. $30,000. Money she had been siphoning off for years. Money she claimed she didn't have. I opened the second book. Another $15,000. I opened the third. This one was the most recent. I scanned the transaction log and my finger stopped at the bottom line. The most recent entry dated yesterday. Withdrawal cash. $10,000. Location Hartsfield Jackson International Airport Terminal F. I checked the other 2 books. Same date, same location, same transaction type. Withdrawal cash. $12,000. Withdrawal cash. $8,000. They hadn't just bought plane tickets. They had liquidated everything. They had drained $30,000 in cold, hard cash right before getting on that plane. They were walking around the Maldives with my life savings in their pockets and $30,000 of secret money while I sat here in a house with no water. I stared at the numbers. It wasn't just greed, it was a complete lack of fear. They weren't afraid of getting caught because they didn't think I was smart enough to look. They didn't think I would ever breach the sanctuary. They thought I was the obedient little ATM who would just work harder to refill the machine when they got back. My mother wasn't broke. She was rich. She was rich with stolen money. I took a picture of the passbooks. I took a picture of the receipts lined up next to my bank transfer history. I created a digital folder on my phone named Evidence. I stood up and looked around the bedroom. I saw the framed photos on the dresser. Jamal graduating high school. Emily and Jamal at their wedding. A picture of my mother looking young and beautiful. There were no pictures of me, not a single one. I walked out of the bedroom and closed the door. I didn't lock it. I didn't need to. The secrets were out. I went back to the kitchen. The sun was fully up now, illuminating the dust and the neglect. I had the receipts. I had the bank books. I had the proof of where the utility money went. But I needed one more thing. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went with Jamal. I needed to see just how much of my identity he had stolen. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I tethered it to my phone's hotspot. I navigated to the credit bureau portal. It was time to pull my full credit report. I took a deep breath and hit enter. The screen loaded. And the number that stared back at me made me gasp. 450. My credit score was 450. I scrolled down to the open account section. My eyes widened. It wasn't just one card. There were 5 credit cards opened in my name in the last 18 months. Capital One, Chase Sapphire, Amex Platinum, Discover. City, total outstanding balance $75,000. The addresses on the accounts were all listed as a P.O. box in downtown Atlanta, a box I didn't own, a box Jamal must have rented to intercept the mail. I clicked on the transaction history for the Amex. The charges were a roadmap of Jamal's ego. VIP table at Magic City Strip Club $5,000. Rental of a Lamborghini for a weekend $2,000. Wedding venue deposit for him and Emily $10,000. I paid for their wedding. I sat there staring at the screen. I hadn't just been invited to the wedding as a guest. I had been the financier. The champagne I toasted them with, the food I ate, the dress Emily wore. I paid for it all. And I was paying interest on it right now. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, but I wiped it away angrily. $75,000 in debt. A house in foreclosure. Utilities cut. They had not just used me. They had destroyed me. They had taken my good name, my financial future, and my trust, and they had set it on fire to keep themselves warm. I closed the laptop. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus. He answered on the first ring. I have the proof, I said. I have everything. Send it to me, Marcus said, his voice grim. I am sending it now, I said. And Marcus. Yeah, Keisha. I want to press charges. Identity theft. Fraud. Grand larceny, all of it. I heard the sound of Marcus typing on a keyboard. Consider it done, he said. But Keisha, we need to move fast. If they have that much cash on them, they might not plan on coming back anytime soon. We need to lock down what we can here. They will be back, I said, looking at the calendar on the wall where my mother had marked her return date with a smiley face. They will be back because they think this house is still here waiting for them. They think I am here waiting for them. I stood up and walked to the window. They are coming back for a rude awakening, I whispered. I hung up the phone. I had work to do. I had to pack. I had to get out of this house before the sheriff came to lock the doors. But before I left, I was going to leave them a little welcome home present. I wasn't going to fix the water. I wasn't going to turn on the lights. I was going to make sure that when they walked through that door, the only thing waiting for them was the dark and the cold and the consequences of their own greed. I grabbed a black marker from the drawer and a piece of paper. I wrote one note. I taped it to the refrigerator where the water bill should have been. It said simply, I hope the champagne was worth it. Then I gathered my things, my evidence, and my dignity, and I walked out the door. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of my office, casting long, sharp shadows across my desk. I had driven straight here from the house, bypassing sleep, bypassing the breakdown I knew was waiting for me, and diving headfirst into the only thing I could control: the data. My office was my sanctuary, a place of logic and order, a stark contrast to the crime scene my life had become. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the hum of the hard drive the only sound in the empty building. I logged into the credit bureau's back-end system, not the consumer version, but the professional interface I used to investigate embezzlement suspects. I typed in my own social security number. My fingers hovered over the enter key for a fraction of a second, a final moment of denial, before the truth became immutable facts on a screen. I hit enter. The report loaded and the number hit me like a physical blow to the chest. 450. My credit score was 450. I stared at the 3 digits, blinking, waiting for them to change. A week ago, my score had been 780. I had worked for a decade to build that number, paying every bill early, keeping my utilization low, treating my financial reputation like gold. Now it was garbage. It was the score of someone who had defaulted on everything. It was a financial death sentence. I clicked on the Open Accounts tab, my breath hitching in my throat. It wasn't just the Amex I had found in the drawer. The list scrolled down, an endless parade of debt I had never agreed to. Capital One Venture, $15,000 balance, maxed out. Chase Sapphire Reserve, $22,000 balance, maxed out. City Prestige, $10,000 balance, maxed out. Discover It, $8,000 balance, maxed out. Amex Platinum, $20,000 balance, and below the cards, 2 lines that made my blood run cold. Lending Club Personal Loan, $15,000, interest rate 28%. Upstart Personal Loan, $10,000, interest rate 32%. Total liability, $75,000. I felt a wave of dizziness. $75,000. That was a down payment on a house. That was my freedom. That was years of my life stolen and spent. I clicked on the contact information tab associated with these accounts. Every single one of them was registered to the same address, P.O. Box 492, Decatur, GA. I didn't need to look it up. I knew that P.O. box. Jamal had opened it 3 years ago when he started his failed sneaker resale business because he didn't want his merchandise sitting on the porch. He had kept it even after the business folded. Now I knew why. He needed a place to send the bills where I wouldn't see them. My hands flew across the keyboard, pulling up the transaction histories for the cards. I needed to see it. I needed to see exactly what my life savings had bought them. I opened the Chase Sapphire statement from last June. June 12th. The estate at Piedmont. Wedding venue deposit $12,000. June 14th, luxury catering Atlanta, $8,500. June 15th, bridal couture Buckhead, $3,200. I stopped breathing. June 15th. That was Jamal and Emily's wedding. I remembered sitting in the church pew wearing a dress I had bought on clearance because money was tight. I remembered Emily walking down the aisle in a stunning lace gown that she had bragged cost a fortune. I remembered the open bar, the 5-course meal, the live band. Jamal had toasted the room, bragging about how hard he had worked to give his bride the perfect day. He hadn't worked for it. I had. I was the financier of the wedding where they treated me like the help. I paid for the champagne they drank to toast their own success. I paid for the dress Emily wore while she sneered at my shoes. I switched to the recent loan documents. The dates were from 2 weeks ago. The funds were dispersed via wire transfer to an account ending in 8892, my mother's secret account I had found in the passbook. The memo line on the loan application simply read, "Emergency medical expenses." He used my identity to take out predatory loans to pay for the first-class tickets to the Maldives. They didn't just spend their own money, they leveraged my future to buy their luxury. This wasn't just theft, this was identity theft. Wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy. My brother had used my social security number, my date of birth, and my mother's maiden name information he had access to because we grew up in the same house to systematically destroy me. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew a fraud alert would eventually trigger, but he calculated that by the time I found out they would be sipping coconuts in the Indian Ocean. I looked at the printer in the corner of my office. I hit print all. The machine whirred to life, spitting out page after page of evidence. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic. Every sheet that landed in the tray was another nail in Jamal's coffin. I watched the stack grow. This wasn't just a credit report anymore. It was a weapon. I picked up the warm stack of papers. I felt the weight of it in my hands. $75,000 of betrayal. I wasn't crying anymore. The tears had evaporated in the heat of my rage. I pulled a fresh file folder from my desk drawer, a red one usually reserved for urgent audits. I labeled it in sharp black marker, J. Williams. Fraud. I placed the credit report inside. Then I added the photos I had taken of the receipts and bank books from my mother's room. I had the motive. I had the means. And now I had the paper trail. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus. "I have the numbers," I said when he answered, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Score is 450. Total debt is 75,000. He funded his wedding and this trip on my credit." Marcus let out a low whistle. "That's a felony, Keisha. A serious one. Mandatory prison time." "Good," I said. "Draft the police report. I'm coming to sign it." I hung up the phone and looked at the picture of my family on my desk, a photo from 10 years ago before everything went wrong. I picked it up and dropped it into the trash can. They had turned me into a victim, but they forgot that my job was catching criminals, and I had just caught the biggest ones of my career. The darkness in my apartment was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press against my skin. My power had been cut off 3 hours ago, a silent casualty of the war I was waging against my own bank account to keep my family afloat. I was sitting at my kitchen table by the light of a single dying candle, staring at the mountain of paperwork in front of me. It was a landscape of financial ruin. Jamal's credit card statements, loan default notices, and final warnings were spread out like a map of a country I never wanted to visit. The air was stale and cold, the hum of the refrigerator silenced, leaving the room in an eerie quiet that amplified the pounding in my temples. Then my phone buzzed. The sudden vibration against the wood table sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The screen lit up, casting a harsh, artificial blue glow across the piles of debt. The name flashing on the screen made my stomach turn over. Mom. For a second, a foolish, childish part of me sparked with hope. Maybe she felt it. Maybe she knew I was sitting here in the dark. Maybe she was calling to check on me to say she had a bad feeling and wanted to make sure I was okay. I took a deep breath, swiped the screen, and answered the FaceTime call. The contrast was physically painful. I was instantly blinded by the brightness of a tropical sun. My mother's face filled the screen, framed by a wide-brimmed sun hat and oversized sunglasses that reflected the turquoise ocean behind her. The background was a postcard of paradise, white sand, swaying palm trees, and a sky so blue it looked painted. The sound of gentle waves and distant steel drum music poured out of my phone's speaker, mocking the cold silence of my apartment. Bernice didn't even look at me. She didn't notice the shadows behind me or the way I was squinting against the glare. She didn't ask why I was sitting in the dark. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't even say hello. Keisha, why haven't you transferred the rest of the money yet? Her voice wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation, sharp and piercing even through the digital connection. I need that $2,000 immediately. We are at the spa reception right now and the service here is ridiculous. They are saying Jamal's card was declined. Can you believe the incompetence? Fix it now. I am not going to stand here and lose face in front of these people. I stared at her, my mouth slightly open, the words failing to form. The audacity was so immense it felt like a physical weight. She was calling me from a vacation I had partially funded, demanding more money for a luxury spa treatment, while I was sitting in a home without electricity because I had prioritized their bills over my own utilities. The disconnect between her reality and mine was not just a gap, it was a canyon. I don't have it, Mom, I said, my voice sounding flat and exhausted, stripped of any emotion. Because if I let myself feel anything, I would start screaming and never stop. I don't have $2,000. I don't have $10. I am sitting here in the dark because the electric company just cut my power. I am currently looking at a stack of Jamal's debt collector's letters that you told me didn't exist. My mother stopped adjusting her hat and finally looked at the camera, or rather looked at her own reflection in the corner of the screen. She frowned not with concern, but with annoyance, as if my poverty was a fly buzzing around her head, ruining her view. Don't start with that drama, Keisha, she snapped, waving a hand dismissively. You always have to make everything about you. We are on vacation. This is supposed to be a relaxing time for the family, and you are ruining the vibe. Jamal is stressed. The poor boy tried to pay, but the bank is making a mistake with his card. He needs this massage. He needs to relax. He needs to pay his bills. I countered, my grip on the phone tightening until my knuckles turned white. His card wasn't declined by mistake, Mom. It was declined because it is maxed out. I can't transfer money I don't have. I am done. Bernice pulled her sunglasses down her nose, her eyes narrowing. The shift in her tone was immediate and practiced a transition from annoyance to manipulation that I had witnessed 1,000 times before. Her voice dropped an octave, becoming smooth, dangerous, and laced with that particular brand of guilt she had perfected over decades. So, you are going to be petty. You are going to count pennies with your own flesh and blood. She let out a sigh, shaking her head, as if I were a disappointing toddler. Keisha, listen to me. Jamal is a man. Do you understand what that means? He has pride. He has an image to maintain. It is humiliating for his card to be declined in front of the staff, in front of guests. He needs his dignity. She leaned closer to the screen. the tropical paradise blurring behind her. You are his sister. You are the woman of the family. It is your job to support him to make sure he looks good. That is what we do. We sacrifice. A little hardship for you is nothing compared to the humiliation of a man losing face. Would it really kill you to figure it out? Call the bank, take a loan, do whatever you have to do, but do not let your brother stand here embarrassed. The words hung in the air between us, traversing thousands of miles of ocean to strike me right in the chest. He is a man. He needs face. You sacrifice. It was the mantra of my entire existence, the unspoken rule that had governed every interaction, every financial decision, every moment of my life. I was the fuel, and Jamal was the fire. I was expected to burn myself to ash just to keep him warm. I looked at the debt papers on the table, illuminated by the flickering candle and the glow of my mother's face. I looked at the darkness of my apartment. And then I looked at her sipping a cocktail with a little umbrella in it, asking me to bleed a little more so her son wouldn't have to feel the consequences of his own actions. Something inside me didn't just break, it evaporated. The guilt, the obligation, the desperate need for her approval, it all just vanished, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. No, I said. My mother blinked, stunned. Excuse me, I said no. I repeated, my voice steady and cold. I am not sending the money. I am not fixing his card. And I am not sacrificing another second of my life for his dignity. Let him be embarrassed. Maybe it will teach him something. Keisha, don't you dare! She started, her voice rising in anger, her face contorted with the threat of the explosion to come. I didn't wait for the rest. I didn't wait for the guilt trip, the yelling, or the tears. I simply pressed the red button. The screen went black. The paradise vanished. The light died, plunging me back into the absolute darkness of my apartment. I sat there in the silence, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, waiting for the crushing weight of guilt to descend. But as the seconds ticked by, realized with a start that I didn't feel guilty. For the first time in my life, sitting in the cold and the dark, I felt the first tiny spark of freedom. 2 weeks of silence shattered in an instant, the peace of my apartment fracturing like a dropped mirror as the front door swung open. The air, which had settled into a still, cool quiet during my time alone, was immediately displaced by a chaotic whirlwind of noise, heat, and the cloying scent of coconut oil mixed with stale airplane cabin air. They were back. My mother, Jamal, and Emily swept into the entryway, bringing with them an energy that felt less like a family homecoming and more like a hostile invasion force reclaiming occupied territory. They looked like strangers, their skin bronzed deep and golden from 14 days under a tropical sun, their teeth flashing white against the tan, their bodies draped in bright, loose resort wear that looked ridiculous against the gray, peeling paint of our hallway. They moved with the casual, arrogant swagger of people who had spent half a month being waited on hand and foot, and they clearly expected that service to continue the moment they crossed the threshold. I was standing near the kitchen, a rag in my hand, having just finished wiping down the counters in a futile attempt to make the space feel orderly before their arrival. I didn't even get the chance to speak. There was no hello, no embrace, no flicker of recognition that they were seeing a human being and not a piece of furniture. Jamal was the first to acknowledge my existence, not with words, but with a heavy, hard-shell suitcase. He didn't set it down, he shoved it. With a grunt of exertion, he launched the massive bag forward, letting it skid across the floor until it slammed violently into my shins. The impact knocked the wind out of me, the hard plastic digging into bone. But before I could even wince, a second bag, this one, a soft duffel heavy with damp, dirty laundry, hit me square in the chest. Bernice had thrown it without even looking at me, already bypassing me to inspect the living room. "Here, wash these immediately," she commanded, her voice carrying that familiar scratching tone of dissatisfaction. "The smell of mildew is setting in, and I will not have my silk wraps ruined because you are too lazy to run a machine." I stood there, clutching the dirty bag to my chest, the pain in my legs throbbing in time with my heartbeat. They were treating me like the hotel staff they had just left behind, faceless, nameless, and existing solely to manage their filth. I watched as Emily, glowing with a tan that made her look radiant and healthy, walked into the living room. She didn't sit down. She didn't ask how I had survived without electricity for days. Instead, she ran a manicured finger along the top of the bookshelf, pulling it away to inspect the tip. She wrinkled her nose, a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, transforming her pretty features into something ugly. "It is so dusty in here," she whined, her voice high and nasal piercing through the room. "My throat is already scratching." "God, Keisha, we have been gone for 2 weeks. What have you even been doing?" "The place looks dingy. It feels heavy. I can literally feel the dust settling in my lungs." I stared at her, the absurdity of the complaint lodging in my throat. I wanted to scream that it was hard to see the dust when you were sitting in the dark because the power had been cut. I wanted to scream that I had been working double shifts at the diner just to get the lights back on before they returned. But the words died before they reached my lips because I knew they wouldn't hear them. They didn't care about the struggle. They only cared about the inconvenience it caused them. I was about to turn away to retreat to the kitchen just to breathe when a sharp, stinging pain exploded in my ankle. I gasped, dropping the laundry bag as I stumbled back, catching myself against the wall. I looked down to see Jamal's expensive designer sneaker retreating. He had kicked me. It wasn't a playful tap or an accidental brush. He had pulled his leg back and kicked me with the casual cruelty one might use on a malfunctioning appliance or a stray dog blocking the path. "Wake up!" He barked, his eyes cold and hard, devoid of anything resembling brotherly affection. "Emily is talking to you. Look at this place. It is a pigsty. You are useless. We leave you with one job, just one simple job to keep the house running, and we come back to this. You are lucky we even let you stay here." I looked at him, really looked at him. This man who I had protected, whose debts I had paid, whose lies I had swallowed for decades. He looked at me with such utter contempt that it made my stomach turn. He felt big. He felt powerful. The vacation funded by my sacrifice had inflated his ego to the point where he felt entitled to physically assault me in my own home because there was dust on a bookshelf. Bernice stood by watching the scene with a bored expression, picking at a hangnail. She didn't scold him. She didn't ask if I was okay. She just waited for the show to proceed to its next act. Jamal adjusted his collar, puffing his chest out as he stepped closer to Emily, wrapping a protective, possessive arm around her shoulders. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The aggression faded, replaced by a smug, self-satisfied preening. He looked from Bernice to me, a grin spreading across his face that was supposed to be joyous, but looked more like a predator baring its teeth. "But never mind your incompetence for a second," he announced, his voice booming with self-importance. "We have news. Big news. Better news than you deserve to hear." Emily placed a hand on her flat stomach, looking up at Jamal with a performance of adoration that was almost blinding. She beamed, casting a glance at me that was filled with triumphant pity. "We are pregnant," Jamal declared, the words hanging in the stale air. I blinked. Pregnant. The word felt heavy, loaded with implications I couldn't yet parse. Emily looked glowing, yes, but there was no sign of a baby, no bump, nothing. It must have been incredibly early, barely a line on a stick, but they were announcing it with the fanfare of a royal coronation. "That is why the dust is such a problem," Jamal continued, his tone shifting from celebratory back to commanding. "Emily is in a delicate condition. She needs a clean environment. She needs stress-free surroundings. She needs the best." He turned to me, his eyes narrowing, and delivered the blow that he had clearly been rehearsing since they boarded the plane home. "And that is why you are moving out of the master bedroom." The silence that followed was deafening. My room, the room that was the only space in this entire apartment that was truly mine. The room with the large window that let in the morning light, the only source of joy I had left. "You are moving to the basement," Jamal said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We need your room. It is the biggest. It gets the best sun. We need to start setting up the nursery, and Emily needs good energy. The basement is dark and damp, and that is bad for the baby. Emily needs good feng shui. Feng shui. The word sounded like a joke, a punchline to a cruel prank. He was evicting me from my own bedroom, banishing me to the unfinished concrete-floored basement where the boiler hummed and the spiders lived, all because Emily needed good feng shui for a fetus that was currently the size of a poppy seed. Bernice nodded in agreement, chiming in, as if this was the most logical solution in the world. It makes sense, Keisha. You are a single woman. You do not need all that space. The baby needs room to grow, and really the basement is private. It will be good for you. You can have your little space down there and stay out of the way. Emily needs peace and quiet, not your negative energy clouding up the main floor. I looked at the three of them, a united front of selfishness. The golden son, the pregnant princess, and the matriarch who enabled them both. They stood there tanned and rested, demanding that I, the one who kept the lights on, descend into the darkness so they could bask in the light. They weren't asking. They were taking. Just like they had taken my money, my time, and my dignity. Now they were taking my sanctuary. And as I looked at Jamal's smirk, I realized he enjoyed it. He liked the idea of putting his big sister in the cellar. It made him feel like the man of the house. "Fine," I said. The word was a whisper, a surrender that wasn't a surrender at all, but the quiet click of a lock finally turning. "Good," Jamal sneered. "Get your stuff out by tonight. We want to start painting tomorrow." "Yellow, I think. Like the sun." He turned his back on me, dismissing me entirely, and led his wife and mother into the living room, leaving me standing alone in the hallway with the dirty laundry and the bruising on my leg, staring at the closed door to the basement that was now my designated place in their world. I did not argue, and I did not fight, because fighting required energy I simply no longer possessed. Like a ghost, haunting the periphery of my own life, I began the slow, humiliating procession from the light and warmth of the upper floors down into the bowels of the house. I carried my life in cardboard boxes and black garbage bags, navigating the narrow, creaking stairs that led to the basement. Every step down was a step away from dignity and a step further into the exile they had designed for me. Above my head, I could hear the thumping of footsteps as Jamal and Emily enthusiastically claimed my former sanctuary, dragging furniture and laughing, planning the color of the paint that would erase my existence from those four walls. Down here, the air was different, thick with moisture and the acrid scent of earth and neglect. It was a space that had been forgotten, a graveyard for broken appliances and holiday decorations that hadn't seen the light of day in a decade. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a weak yellow glow that barely reached the corners, where shadows seemed to pool like stagnant water. Cobwebs draped across the wooden beams like tattered lace brushing against my face as I tried to clear a space large enough for my mattress. I was surrounded by the detritus of my family's history, the things they didn't want to look at but couldn't bear to throw away. Most of it belonged to my father, who had passed away 5 years ago, leaving a void that Bernice had filled with bitterness and Jamal had filled with entitlement. His old workbench was pushed against the far wall, piled high with rusted tools and cans of solidified paint. I set down a box of books, my back aching from the strain, and looked around at my new prison. It was damp, it was cold, and it was mine. I began to shift the piles of junk, trying to create a semblance of order in the chaos. I grabbed a heavy mildewed tarp that was covering a stack of crates in the corner and pulled it free. As the heavy fabric slid away, it snagged on something sitting precariously on the edge of the workbench. There was a screech of metal on wood, followed by a deafening clang as a heavy object plummeted to the concrete floor. The noise echoed in the silence, causing me to jump, my heart hammering against my ribs. I froze, waiting for a shout from upstairs for Jamal to stomp on the floorboards and demand silence, but the laughter overhead continued uninterrupted. I looked down at what had fallen. It was an old iron box, rusted at the hinges and dented on one side. I recognized it vaguely, a memory from childhood of my father sitting at his desk guarding this box while he sorted through papers. He had always been a quiet man, a man who observed more than he spoke, a man who I often felt was disappointed by the way Bernice coddled Jamal, but too tired to stop it. I knelt on the cold concrete, the damp seeping through the knees of my jeans, and reached for the box. The impact of the fall had done what years of rust had tried to prevent. The lock had sprung open. The lid sat askew, revealing the contents within. It wasn't filled with cash or jewels as a child might have fantasized. It was filled with papers yellowed with age and smelling of old tobacco and cedar. I reached in my fingers, brushing against the brittle edges of receipts and old photographs, until they closed around a thick, creamy envelope at the very bottom. It was sealed with red wax, a formality that seemed out of place in this damp basement. On the front, in my father's distinct, neat block lettering, were words that made the breath catch in my throat. For Keisha, when you are mature enough. I sat back on my heels, the box forgotten, the sounds of the house above fading into a dull buzz. My father had left this for me. Not for Bernice, not for Jamal, for me. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely break the seal. The wax cracked with a sharp snap and I pulled out a sheaf of documents stapled together with a blue legal cover. I unfolded them, smoothing the pages against my thigh, straining to read the dense typed text in the dim light of the single bulb. It was a trust deed. The legal language was dry and complex, but as I read, my eyes scanning the paragraphs with increasing speed and disbelief, the meaning became crystal clear. My father, a man who had seen more than he let on, a man who had apparently understood the dynamics of this family better than I ever gave him credit for, had made a plan. He had not left the house to Bernice. He had not left it to us jointly. He had placed the property, the deed, the land, and everything on it into a trust, and the sole beneficiary of that trust was me. I read the clause again, my finger tracing the line to ensure I wasn't hallucinating in the gloom. The property is to be held in trust for my daughter Keisha until she reaches the age of 30. Until that time, her mother Bernice shall act as trustee with the right of residency. Upon Keisha's 30th birthday, the trust shall dissolve, and full legal title and ownership of the property shall transfer exclusively to her. I stopped breathing. I read the date on the document. It had been signed and notarized 6 months before he died. I looked at the date on my phone. I was 32 years old. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I was 32. I had turned 32 years ago. For 2 years, this house had legally been mine. For 2 years, Bernice had been living here, not as the owner, but as a guest who had overstayed her welcome. She knew. She had to know. As the trustee, she would have received the notifications. She had received the paperwork. She had hidden this box. She had buried the truth in the basement, hoping I would never find it, hoping I would remain the obedient servant forever. A cold fury began to rise in me, starting in my toes and spreading upward, turning my blood to ice. All the threats, all the times she told me I was lucky to have a roof over my head, all the times Jamal had told me to get out, all the manipulation, the guilt, the demands for rent money to pay a mortgage that should have been under my control. It was all a lie, a massive orchestrated theft of my life and my autonomy. They weren't just ungrateful family members mooching off my kindness. They were trespassers. They were squatters in my home. I looked up at the ceiling, at the wooden beams that supported the floor, where they were currently walking, where they were currently laughing at my misfortune. They thought they had banished me to the dungeon. They thought they had put me in my place. But in their arrogance, they had sent me exactly where I needed to be to find the weapon that would destroy them. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I carefully folded the document and placed it back in the envelope. I stood up, my knees cracking, the coldness of the basement no longer bothering me because the fire inside me was burning hot enough to consume everything. I wasn't the little sister anymore. I wasn't the daughter who owed them everything. I was the landlord. And eviction day was coming. The fluorescent lights of Marcus's office were a stark clinical white, a sharp contrast to the murky yellow gloom of the basement I had just escaped. I sat on the edge of a leather chair that cost more than my entire wardrobe, my hands clutching the strap of my bag as if it contained the nuclear launch codes. In a way it did. Inside was the rusted iron box and the envelope that had rewritten my entire history. Marcus sat across from me, a sleek mahogany desk separating us. We had gone to high school together, shared lunch tables and homework answers, but the man in front of me now was miles away from the lanky teenager I remembered. He was sharp-tailored and radiated a kind of predatory competence that usually intimidated me, but today it felt like a shield. I watched him read. He had been silent for 10 minutes, his eyes scanning the yellowed pages of the trust deed, his expression unreadable. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall and the occasional rustle of paper as he turned a page. I held my breath, a part of me terrified that he would look up and tell me I was wrong, that I had misunderstood the legalese, that I was still just the unwanted sister living in the cellar. Finally, Marcus set the documents down. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a slow, deliberate movement. Then he looked at me. There was no pity in his eyes, which was a relief. Instead, there was a cold, hard glint of fury that matched the fire burning in my own chest. He didn't speak immediately. He reached for a file folder, opened it, and placed the trust deed carefully inside, treating it with the reverence of a holy relic. Keisha, do you have any idea what they have done? Marcus asked, his voice low and dangerously calm. This isn't just about them being bad family members. This isn't just about them being selfish or cruel. This is criminal. He tapped a finger on the file. Your father was a brilliant man. He knew exactly who Bernice was. He knew she would squander everything if given the chance. This trust was ironclad. It explicitly states that upon your 30th birthday, the title transfers to you, automatically. Bernice's role as trustee expired 2 years ago. For 2 years, she has been living in your house, spending your equity, and treating you like a servant in a kingdom you already own. He leaned back, a humorless, chilling smile playing on his lips. They didn't just steal your money, Keisha. They didn't just steal your identity to rack up debt in your name. They have been committing fraud on a massive scale. They have been occupying a residence without the owner's consent. They are trespassers. They are squatters. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Squatters. My mother. My brother. The people who had just banished me to the basement. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. Keisha, you need to change your mindset right now. You walked in here acting like a victim. You are hunched over, you are scared, and you are waiting for permission to be angry. Stop it. You are not the victim here. You are the landlord. And a landlord has the right to evict tenants who don't pay rent, who destroy property, and who abuse the owner. The word echoed in the room. Landlord. It felt foreign, heavy, and powerful. I wasn't the little sister. I wasn't the daughter. I was the owner. I held the deed. I held the power. The realization washed over me like a cold shower, shocking my system into a new state of awareness. I thought about Jamal kicking me. I thought about Emily sneering at the dust. They weren't my superiors. They were my guests. And they were terrible ones. So what do we do? I asked, my voice steadying, losing the tremor that had been there since I found the box. Do we call the police? Do we go to court today? I want them out, Marcus. I want them out of my house. I want them out of my life. Marcus turned back to me, the predator's glint in his eyes sharpening. We could do that. We could file an immediate eviction notice. We could have the sheriff there by tomorrow morning to throw their luggage onto the lawn. It would be quick. It would be effective. He paused, walking back to the desk and leaning over it, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But why go for quick when we can go for total destruction? You told me Jamal is planning something. A party. I nodded. A baby shower. Emily is barely pregnant, but they are already planning a massive celebration. They want to invite everyone. The church members, the neighbors, Jamal's business partners, which are just guys he owes money to. They want to show off the house. They want to show off the nursery. My room. They are painting it yellow tomorrow. Marcus laughed a short, sharp bark of sound. A baby shower. In a house they don't own. Using money they stole from you. It is perfect. It is absolutely perfect. He sat down and pulled a legal pad toward him, clicking his pen. Listen to me closely. If we serve them now, they will spin it. They will cry to the family that you are heartless, that you are kicking out a pregnant woman and an elderly mother. They will play the victim card, and people might believe them. They will hide the money they stole. They will destroy evidence. But he continued, his pen scratching furiously across the paper. If we wait, if we let them build their stage, if we let them invite the audience, we let them spend every last dime they have on this party, we let them gather everyone whose opinion they care about in one room. And then when they are at their highest point, when Jamal is toasting his own success and Bernice is preening like a queen, we pull the rug out. We don't just serve them with eviction papers, Keisha. We serve them with a lawsuit for fraud, embezzlement, and theft. We do it publicly. We do it when they have nowhere to hide. We make sure that every single person in that room knows that the champagne they are drinking was bought with your stolen money, and the roof over their heads belongs to the woman they forced into the basement. I pictured it. I pictured the living room filled with flowers and gifts. I pictured Emily glowing and Jamal boasting. And then I pictured the look on their faces when the truth crashed the party. It wasn't just justice. It was a reckoning. It was the only way to ensure they could never lie their way out of this again. Do it, I said, the fear in my gut replaced by a cold, steely resolve. Let's wait. Let them have their party. Marcus nodded, satisfied. In the meantime, you go back there. You play the part. You act like the beaten-down sister. You let them paint the room. You let them order you around. You don't say a word. You gather more evidence. Take photos of their spending. Document everything they destroy. Every insult they throw at you is just another line item on the lawsuit. You are a spy in your own house now, Keisha, and when the day comes, we won't just evict them, we will ruin them. I stood up, slinging my bag over my shoulder. The weight of the iron box was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like ammunition. I walked out of Marcus's office and into the bright sunlight, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to look down. I headed back to the house, back to the basement, back to the darkness. But this time I wasn't going as a prisoner. I was going as the executioner, waiting for the perfect moment to drop the blade. The backyard had been transformed into a stage set for a play about a life my family did not actually live. Where there had once been patchy grass and a rusting fence, there were now manicured hedges rented for the day and draped in fairy lights that twinkled even in the afternoon sun. Round tables covered in crisp lemon-yellow linens dotted the lawn, each centered with an explosion of white lilies and yellow roses that must have cost more than my monthly grocery budget. A string quartet played soft, unrecognizable classical music in the corner, drowning out the distant hum of city traffic and creating a bubble of expensive exclusivity. It was beautiful, and it was nauseating because every petal, every ribbon, and every crystal flute was paid for, with money that had been siphoned from my future. I stood near the catering tent, hidden behind a large floral arrangement, adjusting the collar of the black and white uniform Bernice had thrown at me that morning. It was a generic polyester server's outfit, likely bought from a costume shop or a discount uniform supply store. It was ill-fitting and scratchy, tight across the shoulders and loose at the waist, but it served its purpose perfectly. It stripped me of my identity. In this outfit, I was not Keisha the sister. I was not Keisha the daughter. And I certainly was not Keisha the homeowner. I was the help. I was a prop designed to blend into the background, silent and serviceable, while the stars of the show took their bows. Jamal was circulating through the crowd of guests, with a glass of sparkling cider in his hand, acting the part of the benevolent patriarch. He wore a linen suit that screamed leisure and wealth, his laugh booming a little too loudly as he slapped the backs of men he owed money to. Emily sat on a high-backed wicker chair that resembled a throne positioned under a white canopy to shield her delicate complexion from the sun. She wore a flowing yellow dress that billowed around her, resting a hand protectively over a stomach that was still completely flat. She looked radiant, glowing with the attention and the satisfaction of having everything she wanted. The guests were a curated mix of people designed to validate their delusions. There was Pastor Williams holding a plate of hors d'oeuvres, nodding solemnly as Jamal spoke, likely hearing a fabricated testimony about God's blessings and financial abundance. There were the neighbors from down the street, people who drove luxury cars and had never once looked me in the eye when I took out the trash, but who were now smiling at Bernice as if she were the Queen Mother. And then there were Emily's friends, a gaggle of women in pastel dresses who cooed over the baby clothes and whispered behind their hands, casting judgmental glances at the hired help. My job was to keep the glasses full. Bernice had been very specific. I was to circulate. I was to be invisible. And I was not to speak unless spoken to. I picked up a silver tray, heavy with crystal flutes of non-alcoholic champagne, and stepped out from the shadows. The sun hit my face, and for a moment I felt a flicker of the old shame, the desire to shrink away and hide in the basement. But then I felt the weight of the tray in my hands, and I remembered the weight of the iron box. I remembered the deed. I wasn't serving them. I was gathering evidence. I was inspecting my property. I moved through the crowd, offering drinks with a blank expression. I approached a group where Bernice was holding court. She looked spectacular in a royal blue dress, her hair piled high on her head, her makeup flawless. She held a glass of wine in one hand and gestured expansively with the other. "It is such a blessing," Bernice was saying, her voice pitching perfectly to carry over the music. "We are just so proud of Jamal. He has worked so hard for this. You know, he bought this house with his own bonuses from last year, paid cash. He wanted to make sure his family was secure before the baby arrived. He is such a provider, just like his father was." I froze, the tray trembling slightly in my hands. The lie was so bold, so easily spoken, that it took my breath away. She was standing on my land, drinking my wine, telling the pastor and the neighbors that my brother had bought this house with cash. She was erasing my father's legacy and my ownership in a single breath, rewriting history to glorify her golden child. "Oh, he is a good man," Pastor Williams agreed, nodding appreciatively. "It is rare to see young men taking such responsibility these days. You have raised him well, Sister Bernice." "Thank you, Pastor," Bernice preened, soaking up the praise like a flower drinking rain. "We try, we really try. But you know how it is. You do your best, and you pray." She sighed, then a dramatic, tragic sound that drew the circle closer. Her eyes flicked toward me, where I stood hovering with the tray. She didn't look at me with recognition, but with a practiced, performative pity. "Not all of our children flourish. Unfortunately," she said, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that was meant to be heard. "You see that girl there, the one serving the drinks? That is Keisha, my daughter." The guests turned to look at me. I kept my face impassive, staring at a point over their shoulders, refusing to make eye contact, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. "Poor thing," Bernice continued, shaking her head sadly. "She has had such a hard time, struggles with her mind, you know. She cannot hold down a real job. She cannot manage her own life. It breaks a mother's heart, truly. We have to let her live here with us, of course. Where else would she go? We try to give her little chores like this to make her feel useful, to give her some sense of purpose. But it is a burden, I will not lie. Raising a child who just refuses to launch." The guests made sympathetic noises, clucking their tongues and shaking their heads. One of the neighbors, a woman with too much jewelry, looked at me with a mixture of disgust and charity. "You are a saint, Bernice," she said, "to take care of an adult child like that, especially with a grandbaby on the way. Most people would have put her in a home." "We do what we must for family," Bernice said bravely, taking a sip of her wine. Jamal is so patient with her. He lets her stay in the basement apartment so she has her privacy, but we have to watch her. You never know with her moods. I walked away. I didn't storm off. I didn't throw the tray. I simply turned on my heel and walked back toward the catering tent, my movements smooth and mechanical. Inside my chest, however, a nuclear reactor was melting down. The shame I expected to feel was gone, incinerated by the white-hot heat of rage. She had called me crazy. She had called me a burden. She had told the world that I was a charity case living on her generosity, when the truth was that she was a parasite living on mine. She had painted a picture of a benevolent family, caring for their broken daughter, while standing in the middle of a crime scene she had created. Every smile she flashed was an insult. Every lie she told was a theft. I set the tray down on a folding table, the crystal glasses clinking together. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of cut flowers and expensive perfume that drifted in from the garden. They were having their moment. They were standing on the summit of their deception, looking down on the world and feeling untouchable. Let them talk, I thought, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. Let them tell their stories. Let them build their tower of lies as high as it will go, because the higher they build it, the further they are going to fall. I checked my watch. It was time. Marcus would be pulling up to the curb any minute now. The party was in full swing. The audience was captivated. The stage was set. I smoothed the front of my server's uniform. I picked up a fresh bottle of champagne. I walked back out into the sunlight, ready to serve the final course. They wanted a show. They wanted a tragedy about a poor broken girl. I was about to give them a plot twist they would never forget. The room quieted down as I made my way to the microphone stand, the heels of my shoes clicking against the hardwood floor with a deliberate, steady rhythm that echoed in the sudden silence. Jamal was sitting at the head table, a glass of expensive champagne in his hand, looking up at me with that familiar smug grin that had been plastered on his face all evening. He gave me a small nod, likely expecting a speech about his brilliance, his resilience, or perhaps a groveling public apology for my earlier coldness. Beside him, Emily smoothed the skirt of her designer dress, her eyes darting around the room to ensure everyone was watching their moment of glory. I tapped the microphone once, the sound reverberating through the speakers and drawing the final few wandering eyes toward the stage. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs, centering myself. For years, I had been the silent sister, the one who fixed the messes, the one who paid the bills in the dark while they lived in the light. But tonight, the darkness was about to be illuminated. I looked out at the sea of expectant faces and smiled, though the warmth did not reach my eyes. I told them that today was indeed a day for the history books, a day to celebrate the truth behind my brother's lavish lifestyle. I said that words often fall short of capturing the true essence of a man like Jamal. So instead of a toast, I had prepared a special visual presentation, a short documentary, if you will, chronicling the reality of his journey to this very moment. I signaled the technician at the back of the room and the lights dimmed. The large projection screen descended behind me, glowing with a harsh white light before the first slide materialized. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd as the image sharpened. On the left side of the screen was a vibrant, high-definition photo of Jamal and Emily in an overwater bungalow in the Maldives holding tropical drinks taken just 3 months ago. The date stamp was clearly visible in the corner. Directly next to it, I had placed a scanned copy of the final utility shutoff notice for our family home, dated the exact same week. The bold red letters threatening disconnection for non-payment stood in stark contrast to the turquoise waters of their vacation. I let the silence stretch, allowing the guests to do the math, allowing them to realize that while my brother was sipping cocktails in paradise, the electricity in his childhood home was being cut off. Before the murmurs could turn into questions, I clicked the remote. The screen changed. This time it displayed a series of credit card applications and statements. The name on the account was Keisha Williams, my name, but the signature at the bottom was an unmistakable looping scrawl that belonged to Jamal. Beneath the application were the billing statements, highlighted in yellow. Thousands of dollars spent at the Sapphire Gentlemen's Club and various online gambling sites. The gasp from the audience was audible, this time a sharp intake of breath that sucked the air out of the room. I spoke calmly into the microphone, explaining that these were the investments Jamal had been making while claiming to build his business empire funded by identity theft against his own sister. Jamal started to stand up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor, his face draining of all color, but I was not finished. I clicked the remote one last time. The final slide appeared looming larger than the others. It was a side-by-side comparison of two documents. On the left was the deed to the house we were currently standing in, the house Jamal claimed he had bought with his own hard-earned money. The owner listed was clearly Keisha Williams. On the right was our father's last will and testament, the real one with the paragraph highlighted, that explicitly left the estate to me, citing Jamal's history of financial irresponsibility as the reason for his exclusion. The reaction was visceral. It wasn't just a gasp this time. It was a shockwave. The sound of shattering glass pierced the tension as Emily's hand went limp, her wine glass slipping from her fingers and crashing onto the table before tumbling to the floor. The dark red liquid splashed across the white tablecloth and onto her pale, trembling hands like a fresh wound. She looked at the screen, then at Jamal, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and realization. I looked toward the front row where the family pastor sat. He was a man who had known us since we were children, a man who had baptized Jamal. He wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at my brother, slowly shaking his head, his face etched with a deep, profound disappointment that seemed to weigh heavier than any anger could. The shame in the room was palpable, a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over the guests, but for the first time in my life, that shame did not belong to me. It belonged entirely to them. The silence that had fallen over the room following my presentation was shattered, not by a gasp or a sob, but by the violent scraping of a chair against the floorboards. I watched from the stage as my mother Bernice rose to her feet. Her face was not filled with the shame I expected to see, nor was there any apology in her eyes. Instead, her features were twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She did not look at her son, the criminal I had just exposed. She looked at me. She moved toward the stage with a speed and ferocity I hadn't seen in her since I was a child, pushing past guests and knocking over a flower arrangement in her blind fury. She stormed up the few steps to the platform where I stood, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. She screamed that I was a disgrace, an ungrateful wretch who had destroyed the family name for the sake of petty jealousy. She raised her hand high, aiming to deliver a slap that was meant to humiliate me, to put me back in the small, silent box she had built for me decades ago. But I was not that child anymore. I didn't flinch. I didn't cower. As her hand came down, I reached out and caught her wrist in midair. The sound of my grip stopping her momentum was audible through the microphone I was still holding. Her eyes widened in shock. For the first time in her life, her physical intimidation had failed. I held her gaze, my grip firm but controlled, and I spoke into the microphone so every person in that room could hear the boundary being set. I told her no. I told her that she was the one who had destroyed this family, not me. I told her that her greed, her blind favoritism, and her willingness to sacrifice her daughter to enable her son's criminal lifestyle were the true wrecking balls that had brought us to this moment. I released her wrist with a sharp push, creating distance between us, asserting my physical space in a way I never had before. I reached into the podium and pulled out a thick envelope. I held it up, letting the stage lights catch the legal seal on the front. I announced that this was a formal eviction notice. I explained that since the deed to the house was in my name and since I had never authorized Jamal or Emily or Bernice to live there, they were technically trespassing. I looked at my watch and then back at the stunned crowd. I told them they had exactly 30 minutes to gather their personal effects and vacate the premises. I clarified that this meant 30 minutes to take what they could carry, and that anything left behind would be moved to a storage unit at their expense, provided they could actually pay the bill. My mother stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process the shift in power. She looked to the crowd for support, but faces were turned away, eyes averted. The social capital she had hoarded for years had evaporated the moment the truth hit the screen. But the night was not over. Just as the reality of the eviction began to settle in, a new sound cut through the murmurs of the crowd. It started as a distant wail, but grew rapidly louder until the flashing blue and red lights washed over the windows of the ballroom, painting the guests in strokes of emergency color. The heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open, and Marcus walked in. He wasn't wearing his tuxedo anymore. He was in his full uniform, flanked by two other officers. The room parted for them, like the Red Sea. I watched Jamal's face crumble. He looked for an exit, his eyes darting to the side doors, to the kitchen entrance, anywhere but at the approaching officers, but there was nowhere to go. Marcus stepped up to the head table. He didn't look at me. He was entirely focused on his duty. He asked my brother to stand up. When Jamal hesitated, the two officers moved in, pulling him from his chair. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut was sharp and metallic, a sound of finality that seemed to echo off the high ceilings. Marcus announced the charges in a clear, booming voice that left no room for ambiguity. Identity theft, first-degree financial fraud, forgery, embezzlement. Jamal began to stammer, looking at our mother, begging her to do something to fix it like she always did. But Bernice was paralyzed, watching her golden child being restrained like a common criminal. The illusion of the successful businessman was gone, replaced by the reality of a man in cuffs. Then a high-pitched wail broke the stunned silence. Emily threw herself toward the officers, grabbing at Jamal's arm. She screamed that they couldn't take him, that this was a mistake, that they were ruining her life. She turned her tear-streaked face toward me, her hands cradling her stomach. She pleaded with me to stop this, crying out that she was pregnant, that I couldn't do this to an expectant mother, that the stress would hurt the baby. She begged me to think of her child, even if I hated her. I looked down at her from the stage. I felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of the utility shut-off notices and the credit card bills she had helped rack up. I leaned into the microphone one last time. My voice was calm, devoid of the anger she probably expected. I told her that pregnancy does not grant immunity from the law. I told her that if she and Jamal had enough money to fly first class to the Maldives and stay in 5-star resorts while I was sitting in the dark, then she certainly had enough money to book a hotel room for the night. I told her to use the frequent flyer miles if she had to, but that she needed to leave my house. The officers began to lead Jamal away. He looked back over his shoulder, his eyes meeting mine. For the first time, I didn't see arrogance. I saw fear. I saw a man who had never faced a consequence in his life suddenly facing them all at once. Emily collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably, as her friends, the same ones who had sneered at me earlier, hesitated to comfort her, unsure if they would be implicated by association. I stepped back from the microphone and signaled the DJ to cut the sound system. The feedback whine died down, leaving only the sound of Emily's sobbing and the heavy footsteps of the police escorting my brother out of the life he had stolen. I walked down the stairs of the stage, not toward my family, but toward the exit. I had said my piece. I had reclaimed my name. And as I walked past my mother, who was now slumped against the wall, looking old and defeated, I didn't stop. I checked my watch. 25 minutes left. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but in my case they ground exceedingly fine. The days following the party were a blur of legal proceedings and vindication, a stark contrast to the years of silence I had endured. Jamal's trial was not the media circus he might have hoped for in his delusions of grandeur. It was a sterile, cold dismantling of a man who had never been told no. The forensic accountant Marcus had brought in laid it all bare: the paper trail of forged signatures, the stolen identities, the embezzlement. It was insurmountable. I sat in the back of the courtroom on the day of the sentencing, watching the golden child stand before a judge who saw him only as a thief. There was no mother there to smooth things over, no money left to bribe a way out. When the gavel came down, the sound was final. 5 years in a state penitentiary. I saw his shoulders slump, the arrogance finally draining out of him as the reality of a 5 by 8 cell replaced his dreams of penthouses and private islands. Then there was Emily. The pregnancy she had screamed about as she was being dragged away, the unborn child she had used as a final human shield to protect her lifestyle, turned out to be as fabricated as the rest of their lives. It was a lie, a desperate, clawing attempt to manipulate my sympathy and stall the inevitable. When the truth came out during the investigation, the last remnants of her social standing evaporated. Her own family, humiliated by the public spectacle, and the criminal association cut her off completely. The last I heard, the woman who had sneered at my career and demanded first-class travel was working the checkout line at a discount grocery store 3 towns over. I imagine she spends her days scanning coupons and bagging generic brand cereal, wondering how her life of leisure collapsed so spectacularly into a life of minimum wage labor. But the most pathetic figure in this tragedy was Bernice. With Jamal in prison and the house reclaiming its rightful owner, my mother was left with nothing but the consequences of her own enabling. The eviction was executed to the letter of the law. She was forced to move into a small subsidized apartment in a part of the city she used to turn her nose up at. I heard through the grapevine that the heating is spotty and the walls are thin enough to hear every argument from the neighbors. It is a far cry from the spacious, sunlit rooms she had stolen from me, but it is a roof over her head, which is more than she would have left me with if she had had her way. For months I enjoyed the silence. I renovated the house, scrubbing away the stain of their presence, reclaiming the space that my father had intended for me. But I knew the call would come eventually. Narcissists do not go quietly into the night. They always try to claw their way back in. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was sitting in my living room reading a book in the quiet peace I had fought so hard to earn when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew who it was before I even answered. Her voice was different, thinner, stripped of its usual imperious boom, but the manipulation was still there, woven into every syllable. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize. She launched straight into a sermon. She told me that she was suffering, that the apartment was cold, that she was lonely. She told me that she was praying for me, praying that God would soften my hardened heart. She quoted scripture, her voice trembling with a practiced piety. She reminded me that the Bible teaches forgiveness, that a daughter should honor her mother, that turning my back on family was a sin that would stain my soul. She tried to use faith as a weapon, just as she had used guilt and fear for my entire life. I listened for a long time, letting her pour out her toxic mixture of religious guilt and victimhood. I looked around my warm, beautiful home, the home she had tried to take from me to give to a criminal. I thought about the years of neglect, the bills I paid while they vacationed, the way she had looked at me with pure hatred when I finally stood up for myself. I realized then that she hadn't learned a thing. She still saw herself as the martyr, the long-suffering mother betrayed by a wicked child. When she finally paused to take a breath, expecting me to crumble, expecting me to offer to pay her rent or bring her groceries, I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, and completely devoid of the anger she probably wanted to hear. I told her that she was right, that the Bible is indeed full of wisdom. I told her that while it speaks of forgiveness, it also speaks of justice. I quoted Galatians to her, reciting the verse I had highlighted in my father's old Bible. Do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. I told her that she had spent a lifetime sowing seeds of division, favoritism, and greed. I told her that she had planted a garden of lies and watered it with my tears and my money. And now she was simply harvesting the crops she had tended to so diligently. This was her harvest. The cold apartment, the loneliness, the son in prison, these were the fruits of her labor, not mine. I told her that forgiveness is something that happens in the heart, but it does not require reconnection. It does not require me to set myself on fire to keep her warm. I told her to take care of herself, to use the resourcefulness she had always claimed to possess. I told her that my charity was closed, my bank was closed, and my heart was closed to her manipulation. I didn't wait for her to scream or to cry or to launch into another tirade. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call. Then with a few taps of my thumb, I blocked the number. I blocked Emily. I blocked the prison collect calls from Jamal. I placed the phone back on the table and picked up my book. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, but inside, everything was warm. Everything was quiet, and for the first time in my life, everything was mine. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of possibility, full of peace, and full of a future that finally belonged to me. I had walked through the fire of my family's betrayal and come out the other side not as ash, but as steel. And as I turned the page of my book, I knew that the drama was finally over. The credits had rolled, the house was clean, and I was free. The decision to sell the house came to me not in a moment of anger, but in a moment of profound clarity. For weeks after the eviction and the subsequent legal battles, I had walked through those hallways like a ghost in my own life. Even though I had scrubbed the walls, replaced the furniture, and repainted the rooms in bright, cheerful colors, the air still felt heavy. The architecture itself seemed to hold the echoes of my mother's sharp criticism and my brother's entitled laughter. I realized that a coat of paint could not cover up decades of trauma. This structure was not a home. It was a monument to my subjugation, a museum of bad memories, where I had been the curator of everyone else's happiness but my own. I did not want to fix it. I wanted to be free of it. I called a realtor the week after the sentencing. I didn't haggle over the listing price or worry about maximizing the profit margin. I just wanted it gone. I wanted to convert that wood and brick into liquid potential. The market was hot, and the house sold within days to a young couple who saw only the beautiful bones of the building and none of the ghosts that haunted the corridors. Handing over the keys was the final act of exorcism. As I drove away from the driveway for the last time, I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, on the road stretching out before me, leading me away from the past and toward a future I was finally designing for myself. With the proceeds from the sale combined with the substantial restitution funds, my legal team had successfully clawed back from Bernice's hidden accounts and liquid assets. I found myself with a level of financial freedom I had never dared to imagine. It was a strange irony that the money my family had tried so desperately to steal from me was now the very capital that would fund my liberation. I knew exactly where I wanted to go. I wanted the opposite of that dark, suffocating suburban house. I wanted light. I wanted air. I wanted to be so high up that the petty grievances of the past looked like ants on the sidewalk. I found my sanctuary in the heart of downtown Atlanta. It was a penthouse apartment in a gleaming glass tower, a space that felt like it was floating in the clouds. It had floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a view that sparkled like diamonds at night. When I walked in for the first time, the sunlight flooded the room, warming my skin, and I knew I was home. It was stark modern and unapologetically mine. When I signed the papers, my hand didn't shake. It was the most expensive thing I had ever bought, and yet it felt like the most necessary purchase of my life. I decorated it with art that I loved, with furniture that was comfortable, and with an atmosphere of tranquility that no shouting voice would ever disturb again. But luxury was not the end goal. Purpose was. My experience with Jamal and Emily and the long, painful journey of disentangling my finances from their greed had taught me a brutal lesson about vulnerability. I realized that I was not unique. There were thousands of women out there just like I had been, smart, capable, hardworking women who were being drained dry by the leeches in their family trees because they had been conditioned to believe that saying no was a sin. I saw a gap in the world that needed filling, a wound that needed a specific kind of salve. I took my background in finance, my newfound legal knowledge regarding fraud and asset protection, and my personal history, and I forged them into a shield for others. I opened my own firm, a boutique financial consultancy located just a few blocks from my new home. I didn't want to help corporations hide their profits or help billionaires buy their third yachts. I wanted to help the givers protect themselves from the takers. My firm specialized in financial trauma and asset protection for women dealing with toxic family dynamics. We didn't just look at spreadsheets and tax returns. We looked at the emotional blackmail that often accompanied financial abuse. I hired forensic accountants who could find hidden debts and therapists who could help clients build the psychological boundaries necessary to close their wallets. My office became a safe haven where women could come and tell their stories without fear of judgment, where they could admit that their husband or their father or their sister was stealing from them, and know that I would believe them because I had lived it. I remember my first major client, a woman named Sarah, who was being guilt-tripped by her parents into funding her brother's failed startups. She sat in my office trembling, showing me the texts where her mother quoted scripture to manipulate her into signing a loan guarantee. I looked at her and I saw myself from a year ago. I reached across the desk, not just as a consultant, but as a survivor. I told her that her money was her energy, her time, her life force, and that she had the right to protect it. We built a plan for her. We legally separated her assets. We set up trusts that her family couldn't touch, and we drafted the scripts she needed to say no. When she walked out of my office 2 months later, her finances secure and her head held high, I felt a satisfaction that no amount of money could buy. My life in Atlanta is full. It is busy. It is vibrant. I wake up every morning to the sun rising over the city, casting a golden glow over my living room. I drink my coffee on the balcony, listening to the hum of the world below, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the storm that pushed me here. I don't hate my family anymore. Hate takes too much energy. I simply don't think about them. They are characters in a book I have finished reading, a story that no longer interests me. I am writing a new volume now, one where I am the protagonist, the hero, and the author of my own destiny. And in this story, the only people allowed at my table are the ones who bring love, respect, and their own checkbooks. The airport terminal was humming with the chaotic energy of thousands of people rushing to destinations that likely held obligations, business meetings, or family dramas they were desperate to resolve. I moved through the crowd with a slowness that felt foreign to my old self. For years, my life had been a frantic sprint, a desperate race to put out fires I didn't start and pay bills I didn't owe. I was always rushing to the bank, rushing to work, rushing to fix my brother's mistakes before the police or the creditors noticed. But today, there was no rush. There was no panic. There was only the steady rhythmic click of my own heels on the polished terrazzo floor and the quiet hum of a future that belonged entirely to me. I approached the gate clutching my boarding pass. It wasn't a crumpled piece of paper printed at the last minute in a panic. It was a digital ticket on my phone glowing with a promise. I looked at the zone number, Zone 1. I remembered the stories Jamal used to tell, the lies about his first-class flights and his VIP treatment stories funded by my credit rating and my stolen identity. He had played the part of a wealthy man while I sat in the dark. Today, I was not playing a part. I walked down the jet bridge, the cool air of the tunnel hitting my face, and for the first time I didn't feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. I felt weightless. I stepped onto the plane and turned left. The flight attendant greeted me by name, a small courtesy that felt monumental after years of being treated like a servant in my own home. I found my seat. It wasn't just a seat. It was a sanctuary. Delta 1. I ran my hand over the leather, feeling the reality of it. This wasn't bought with a stolen credit card. It wasn't a result of a scam or a hustle. It was paid for with the sweat of my brow, the intelligence of my mind, and the resilience of my spirit. I sat down and adjusted the controls, watching the partition slide shut, sealing me off from the rest of the cabin. For years, I had been forced to live my life in the open, my boundaries trampled by a mother who felt entitled to my space and a brother who felt entitled to my life. Now, with the push of a button, I could create a wall that no one could breach. The stewardess brought me a glass of champagne. As I held the flute, watching the bubbles rise to the surface, I thought about the Maldives. It was the destination Jamal and Emily had chosen for their fraudulent honeymoon, the backdrop for their lies. They had gone there to take photos to post on social media, to prove to a world that didn't care that they were important. They had gone there to be seen. I was going there to disappear. I wasn't going to post photos. I wasn't going to check in. I was going to sit on a white sand beach, look at the turquoise water, and listen to the sound of absolutely nothing. I was going to reclaim that geography. I was going to wash the stain of their deception off the map and make it my own. The plane began to taxi, the engines roaring to life with a power that vibrated through the floor. I looked out the window as the tarmac blurred the terminal buildings, shrinking into insignificant blocks of concrete. As the wheels left the ground, I felt a physical separation from the earth, a severing of the final gravity that held me to my past. Atlanta, with its penthouse and my thriving business, would be there when I returned. But for now, I was suspended in the air, halfway between the life I had survived and the life I was about to enjoy. I thought about Bernice in her cold apartment, clutching her Bible and her bitterness. I thought about Jamal in his cell, staring at a wall instead of an ocean. I thought about Emily scanning groceries and remembering a life she had only rented. They were trapped in the prisons of their own making, bound by their need for validation, their addiction to appearances. They had spent their lives trying to look rich, trying to look successful, trying to look happy. They had sacrificed their integrity, their family, and their freedom on the altar of perception. I took a sip of the champagne. It tasted crisp and cold like victory. I reclined the seat, letting my body relax into the luxury I had denied myself for so long. I closed my eyes and let the hum of the cabin wrap around me. I realized then that they had been right about one thing, though they had misunderstood the meaning entirely. They used to call me a failure. They used to sneer at my modest clothes and my quiet life. They said I didn't know how to live. They said I didn't know how to shine. They said I was a failure because I didn't know how to put on a show. They said I was boring because I saved instead of spent. They mocked me because I didn't need an audience to feel valuable. But as the plane climbed higher, piercing through the clouds and breaking into the blinding sunlight of the upper atmosphere, I finally understood the truth. They were chasing a ghost. They were chasing the appearance of wealth because they were empty inside. I didn't need to chase anything anymore. I opened my eyes and looked at the clouds stretching out below me like a white ocean. True wealth isn't about the brand of your purse or the number of likes on a photo. It isn't about how many people envy you. It is about the ability to sleep at night without fear. It is about the ability to answer the phone without dread. It is about the ability to board a plane and fly halfway across the world just because you need to hear the ocean. They forgot the most important lesson of all. They forgot that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest. They forgot that integrity compounds like interest while lies' debt accumulates until it bankrupts your soul. True wealth is freedom. It is the freedom to be who you are without apology. It is the freedom to say no. It is the freedom to walk away. And as I looked toward the horizon, toward the islands waiting for me in the Indian Ocean, I knew that I had won. The sweetest revenge isn't screaming. It isn't fighting. It isn't even seeing them suffer. Though justice has its own satisfaction. The sweetest revenge is simply living a life so full, so complete, and so utterly my own that they can never, ever touch it again. The most profound lesson here is that you cannot force others to value you, but you can refuse to be devalued. When Audrey was excluded from the family tradition she helped build, she didn't beg for a spot. She created her own superior sanctuary. Her journey proves that the best response to exclusion isn't anger, but thriving independently. By establishing her own space, she reclaimed her dignity and revealed that true connection is based on authenticity, not performative perfection. Sometimes you must build your own table to find the people who truly deserve to sit with you.